So just to say, I am here not because of my poetry, but because I wanted to lend my support and camaraderie to this mission that our dear Stewart has been on for quite a while, because I have, so I was doing Tolasana when I was 8. My mom is a yoga teacher, my grandma. I grew up around all of this. And then I came to the West, and what I found during my time, teacher trainings, I've taught, I've practiced, I felt there was something very off, to put it lightly, and I myself found myself disenchanted and suspicious, and I left the sort of yoga world. So it would appear that Stewart and I had reached these conclusions coming from very different places, to sort of reach the exact sort of same conclusions, but from different avenues. So it gives me great pleasure to support this. So we'll just get into it. And for those who sort of may not be aware of Stewart Home, the man, the myth, and so forth, perhaps you can fill in the gaps for us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's actually a lot of people here who do know quite a lot about me. I can recognise a few faces, familiar faces turning up like bad pennies, as always. That's a joke because my friend Bridget Penny is here, who I had in the seminar series, which I edited for, not her first book, but Index, a very good book, which I edited for Bookworks, a series, and I had Bridget in the series. But in some ways I did really start here because coming out of punk rock, as I was into the London punk rock scene in the late 70s, I started going to radical bookshops, including this one, and Compendium a lot. Here was coming to Housmans was essential, I was just saying to Al earlier, because it was the only radical bookshop in London when there were he told me there were 52 in the past, back in the day. It was the only bookshop that stocked Red Flag, which was published in Liverpool. Only bookshop in London. It's probably sold at the odd other place. It was published from Liverpool, Red Flag, and it was the UK Posadists magazines. So they were the followers of Juan Posad, who'd once been a professional Argentinian footballer, briefly, and he became a Trotskyist revolutionary, was tortured by the regime, and came to possibly believe in UFOs. You can argue exactly what his position was, but if UFOs did exist, he thought they were kind of emissaries from a higher civilization, and because they had the technology to fly to Earth, they'd obviously evolved to communism, so they were here to support the revolution. So it was always essential to have a look at what Red Flag was saying. They had some more sensible positions, but that more recently, since the 2000s, kind of Posadism has been quite an internet meme if you're into certain areas of the internet. But back in the late 70s through the 80s, this was the only place you could kind of read Posadist publications regularly. So I'm giving away the fact that I wasn't even buying the paper. I was just coming in. I can read it in the shop. They've professionalised a bit since then. My friend Malcolm, who doesn't work here anymore, who'd been a long-term kind of activist around London, had worked for some chain bookstores and learned power shelving, which he came and introduced here when he started working here. And even I worked here, but not for Housmans, because there used to be a bookshop downstairs, second-hand booksellers, Andrew and Barry, who also had Judd books. I don't know if they're still connected to it. So when I wasn't quite making enough from my books and artwork in the late 80s, I would be downstairs once a week selling books, and I can tell you closing up time was the worst because there was always several people who didn't want to leave the shop and you had to kick them out. That's how you learn to be an authoritarian, one way if you're not coming from that position. So yeah, I just, wrote a few novels for my sins, when I was wandering around in the late 70s, ended up at London Workers Group, so we were discussing combining the best of elements of left communism, so the best of Bordegism with the best of council communism. It's a very specific position. If you have it, you often get mistaken for an anarchist because you're anti-Leninist or anti-Bolshevik. I mean, Bordiga wasn't really anti-Leninist. He had a complicated position. I also ended up writing a lot of avant-garde fiction, supposedly. That's how the press describes it, so I believe everything I read about myself. And also working within the art world. I didn't train as an artist, but I thought, you know, if I could be a musician, which I had been in punk bands and indie bands, without knowing anything about music when I started, I could be an artist without really knowing anything about art. So I did successfully infiltrate the art world, and I have more successful friends here, like Rita, who's sitting down here in the art world. But I followed her lead in taking up painting, although I'm now painting standing on my head. And I put the paintbrush between my toes. Rita gave me some great advice on inks and papers, which I took up. So without the help of your friends, you can never quite realise your projects. But the head standing thing, which I'll finish off with, I just wanted to learn. I had a gym membership, and I wanted to learn to stand on my head because I've been to a literary party, met some young author who was worried about doing readings for the first time in public, and I said, don't worry about it, I could do it standing on my head. And I thought, oh yeah, of course I could do it standing on my head. So I'll just demonstrate. This also will demonstrate how I like to cock everything up, because I know these kind of microphones, which I hate. I like the old ones with the leads on. When I go upside down, this will go near my mouth and the volume will be screwed because I'll sound much louder. So this is just to, you know, show that it's not theoretical. You see what I mean about the sound? I knew that was going to happen, but I was waiting for it. So yeah, I used to... this was the, you know, the gym I went to wasn't that far from the National School of Circus Arts, but that's rather expensive to attend, and yoga lessons were free in my gym membership, and they did do headstanding back then. So I learned to stand on my head and would recite from my novels, which often sex and violence scenes, of course, but I'm just going to demonstrate today with I used to write poetry when I was a teenager. Someone foolishly wanted to publish it, so I said, okay, if I can call the collection, send cash, which he said okay. And so this is just an example of the poetry I used to do back in the very old days, very late 70s, in 1980s. Gravity is a useful thing. It makes the world go round. It keeps the stars up in the sky and us down on the ground. And obviously that was just for the headstand, but I'm going to go back to a normal volume now and get down. But that was the only reason I started yoga.
Yeah. So that's I mean, that is true. That is very true. And throughout the book, I've noticed that a number of the characters in this cast, you mentioned their sort of specific interests in headstands. That's the only posture that you mentioned, their specific interest in headstands.
That plant, which is peacock in yoga.
Yeah.
I would point out as well that the yoga headstand is usually a basket, which is why I now always do the tripod, although I can do the basket. But
it began in the gyms.
Exactly.
So let's talk about that. How did you get exposed to this thing that we are not calling yoga?
Modern postural practice.
We are calling it modern postural practice.
Well, in terms of going to the gym, it was probably about 2009.
Yeah.
And I was going to a boxing class, and I noticed there was a yoga class after, and I decided I wanted to stand on my head. So I went to the yoga class, got a very poor reception from a lot of the students who actually complained to the instructor that I was violent because I did boxing. And she grew up in Las Vegas, strangely enough, and said, no, that's okay. Stewart gets out all his violent tendencies in the boxing class, and he's in a perfect mode for doing yoga afterwards. But you know, she also was quite surprised when I learned headstand very fast, which she didn't know that was the only reason I was going, really, that I didn't care for the sun salutations or the plough or anything else. It was just for the headstand. And asked me how come I'd learnt it so fast. I said, I practice every day at home because I write fiction and I wanted to recite the fiction upside down. She said, you can't do that. I said, sorry, I'm already doing it. Did it in Berlin last week. And I think that might have been the first one, I can't remember. No, the first one was in Paris. See, I went a long way from London in case it failed, but but then, you know, I just got curious about some of the stuff that was said in the classes. You know, there was this stuff about chakras, which obviously I'd come across through kind of, as a kid and a teenager, I was always fascinated by con men. So, you know, I'd read my Aleister Crowley, The Great Beast, and even some of his novels. Came across Crowley initially in Dark They Were and Golden Eyed, which I don't know if anyone remembers that bookshop, which was in St Anne's Court, science fiction bookshop, between Dean Street and Wardour Street. So first time I wandered in there was it still in the same, was it in the same place there? I can't remember. 74 was the first time I went to that bookshop, because I started wandering around the West End on my own when I was 12, so with my mates, and find these weird places. But yeah, they were talking about chakras and all, you know, Kundalini and lighting up the serpent power and stuff, which I just thought was a complete load of nonsense. So not that I was unaware of Arthur Avalon and, you know, the serpent power and all those classic colonialist interpretations of religion. You don't like me using the term Indian subcontinent, so you'll have to advise me on the correct one.
Well, it's just, you know, I also resist a lot of everything. So the word sub, that was not, we didn't call ourselves a subcontinent.
The Indian continent.
We weren't the subcontinent. But anyway, you can say Indo-Pak, you could say South Asia, you could say global north, whatever, South, yeah. But yeah, I do have a problem with sub.
Europe is a subcontinent too, I hasten to add. But so yeah, I mean, I also thought I'll just try a load of the other styles, and what was quite curious was that you could go to a class, and each class would be entirely different. So, you know, Ashtanga was interesting because it was more athletic, and it was the only class in the gym that had more young men than women. I mean, most of the yoga class seemed to have older people and predominantly female, but Ashtanga had a predominantly younger male base for the people coming from the gym, and that was it was run by a woman, but obviously the style was created by a man.
Well, we talked about Ashtanga, and for me,
you've done Ashtanga.
Yeah, so I did. That was my entry, and it was, you know, I did level 1, I did level 2, but that was when I began to find something very wrong in what you were saying about the boxing. I found that people were leaving these yoga classes, as one of my good teachers said, ready to beat people up. And it was more about the athleticism and the competitive sort of edge, rather than anything that I had ever been led to understand. And that seemed highly fascist, frankly. So, and I think that's what you said as well, is that you found that this athleticism is sort of an offshoot of this yoga becoming part of a Western construct.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you go back to talk about the more general arguments, having encountered a lot of different yoga styles, I tried several dozen, and I would point out that of those, only 2 were created by women. One is a quite obscure form of Brazilian yoga, and the other was forest yoga, which people may know, which is meant to deal with trauma and stuff, and which I really didn't like. I did actually quite like the Brazilian yoga as styles of yoga go. But you know, predominantly the styles were invented by men, but in my experience, I was mainly taught by women. And for a whole lot of reasons, and also because some of I particularly disliked the Iyengar teacher, who told me asked me if I could do a headstand. I said yes. I did it in the middle of the room, and she started screaming at me, "No, you don't do it like that. You do it against a wall." It's like, I've never been to an Iyengar class before. How do I know? You asked me if I could do a headstand. I said yes, and did it. And then the British Wheel of Yoga teachers I found really horrendous as well. There was one who when you went to the class, she put you into a kind of meditation for about 20 minutes so she could read some crummy essay she'd written. And the one I experienced happened to be about the civil rights movement in America. And I'm just, she's lying you there in Shavasana corpse pose. And you're thinking, wow, it's only real weirdos like Frank Rudolph Young who tell you should do this for half an hour. In most classes, it's like 3 to 5 minutes at the end. Yeah. And she's talking about civil rights movement, great, in America in the 60s. But she only mentions Christian civil rights. Yeah. Whereas, of course, Muhammad Ali, Michael X, there's a lot of important Muslim figures as well in the American civil rights movement. So you're thinking, this is weird. This is so... You quite often come up against this with my experience of the yoga in the gym, that it was very Christian at base, which when I went into looking for information about it, it's because of roots in kind of New Thought and Christian strands coming through in Western modern postural practice, or what people call yoga. Yeah. So when I started reading up on yoga, one of the key texts for me was a book called Yoga Body by Mark Singleton. Yeah. And he is basically arguing that yoga was invented in India in the 1920s and 30s, where people mixed kind of yogic practices and Hinduism and other things, because Hinduism isn't the only source for this material. I mean, Jain religion, precursors to, where it's predominantly Muslim on the Indian continent, not subcontinent now, and kind of tantric, all sorts of things fed into it. The BJP want to claim yoga as Hindu, but its roots are much broader than that. I mean, obviously Buddhism is closely related, but there's also strands from there. But anyway, Singleton's argument was that it was invented in India in the 20s and 30s by people mixing, and it wasn't original to him, it comes from other people, but we won't go into the whole history of the more minor books. It was mixing Western gymnastics brought to India by the British Army and army drills with native practices, if you can bear the word native, sorry, apologies. When I went to look at where does yoga come from in the West, which was what I wanted to write about in the book, because it didn't strike me as very Indian, and possibly because my first experiences with yoga were as a kid. I'd come home from school and put on the TV, and there was this, I don't know if it was broadcast outside of London, but there was this program called, it was Richard Hiddleman. What was the program called? Yoga for Health. So it's this American kind of sales guy with two white women in kind of leotards, to him telling them what to do, and they demonstrate the moves. And I didn't find it very interesting. It's like, why can't the banana splits or something come on, was my attitude. But sometimes if I was bored and it was raining so you couldn't run around the streets, I would try a few of the exercises and discovered I could do lotus position. I don't know how accurately I was doing any of the rest, because I wasn't paying a lot of attention. It was just really on in the background.
And you didn't have an Iyengar teacher?
No, to be a fascist about my alignment. So you've got to spend 10 minutes arranging all these blocks so you can then do this posture. I only ever went to one Iyengar class. It was too much. The teacher was quite old and apparently had been taught by Iyengar himself, at least so it was claimed. But the weirdest thing about that class, there was an old guy who sat at the end of the exercise, lay at the end of the exercise studio with a towel over his face for the entire lesson, and apparently that was his practice because he wasn't up to doing anything else. But it was quite unlike anything else I'd ever seen in the gym. But anyway, so Singleton's argument and the argument of other academics, I mean there's a whole range of writers on this, is that yoga is a hybrid synthesis of different elements created in India in the 20s and 30s. But as I went back reading a kind of history of yoga fairly randomly from what I came across, I was also coming across figures like Pierre Bernard or the great Om, who kind of came out of a kind of Houdini-style act and going into death trances. He first appears in the papers in 1898, I think it is. And then certainly by 1910 and possibly by as early as 1905, he was teaching what looks like modern postural practice. So it's like, well, did this actually originate with him? Because the academic writers about the origins of kind of modern postural practice as opposed to ancient yoga are saying it's in India in the 20s onwards. But this is a decade, maybe a decade and a half, maybe 2 decades earlier that this guy's doing this. So that kind of opened the question for me. If he did originate it, did it kind of also occur spontaneously within the Indian continent later on, or was there a route transmission? I can't answer that question, but I can.
Well, and just to say that so there's a host of characters. So there we have Pierre Bernard, the great because they didn't spell it right. So he ended up being known as the great rather than the great Om.
2 O's.
Which I think says everything about everything to do with what you're talking about this sort of, it's like an Orientalist carnival of sorts with all these sideshow acts. And what's interesting is, so when you're talking about Pierre Bernard, what you've done is you've traced rigorously. So there is some rigorous lineages that Stewart has given us in this book, where there's apparently, so Pierre's claim to fame was somebody called Sylvia Hamati.
He claimed was his guru.
And what's very interesting is how nobody quite knows whether this was a Syrian person, or they were brown, or were they Indian, were they half white, or and it just goes on like that.
And every when you try and trace the origin of all the information about him, most of it comes back to a guy who wrote his biography called Robert Love. And then when you look at academics and you look at their footnotes, they say they got the information from Robert Love. But Robert Love's proof of, there were a lot of disputes about what his original name was, where he was born, what date he was born, and different dates. But Robert Love proves this by saying he was told the correct date by a relative of Bernard who saw it written in a family Bible, which is, completely uncheckable. And he also claims that he has proof of Hamyati as Bernard's guru lineage, in that it's he gives the initials of the International Journal of the Tantric Order, but doesn't name the journal and says it's in an interview in this publication. So I thought, well, that sounds like the International Journal of the Tantric Order. That's the initials, they're the same. Let's go and look at that. And you go and look at that. And yes, this was published by Bernard, possibly edited by Bernard. Bernard also used a lot of pseudonyms. So although the article isn't written by a known pseudonym of him, it was possibly also written by him. There's an interview with a genuine monk who confirms that this guru lineage, and also confirms that Bernard's yoga is even better than that of those on the Indian continent. But of course, the reference isn't given explicitly, so unless you're determined to figure it out, you won't find it. Or
you just go and write a book called Fascist Yoga and don't bother, because what the overarching theme that I get from all these characters, and this is throughout the book, is that everyone's desperate to prove some authentic something, but it never emerges.
No, and it's the same with some of the Indian gurus fake their guru lineages.
Yes.
Although that's not my interest, because I'm interested in Western modern postural practice. So with Bernard, with the International Journal of the Tantric Order, again, this would make you doubt that he had spent years and years and hours every day with a genuine tantric guru to teach him this stuff, because as kind of academics who specialize in tantra and things say, it's a typical fin de cercle mishmash of Orientalist ideas with Western occultism and sex magic. It's not a publication produced by someone who's genuinely tutored in what
he could have been printing it in his basement.
He probably was, And then Bernard, there's not a lot of text written by him, but he has some disciples, so we'll move on to those to show where it becomes really worrying.
Yes.
So one of his disciples was Hamish McLaren, who wrote a book called Eastern Thought for Western Minds, with an introduction by Francis Yates Brown, who we might move on to. But anyway, McLaren and Brown and other people around Bernard, his disciples, claimed that yoga was invented by the blonde, blue-eyed Aryan invaders of the Indus Valley, which Sascha can tell you about.
I have the quote here. So this is actually an astounding part of your research that, for me, it was alarming, but also makes total sense. So all of these hucksters, they went off to find this sort of knowledge from the East, but they all came up, and this is in separate instances. Stewart mentions this. Yoga and Tantra were claimed as Aryan. That is white. Pursuits by Bernard's circle on the basis that the Hindu caste system was created to preserve racial purity in India, and those of high caste were, at the inception of the system, Aryan, which is the same position as Nazi racial theorists. So by this lineage, therefore, it is our heritage. It is the white man's heritage. So Bernard was the first sort of proponent, vocal proponent of this kind of thinking. But then...
And then, I mean, McLaren is not only saying it's Aryan, but he's saying it's the true Aryan religion and that Christianity is Semitic. So you shouldn't be a Christian, you should be a yogi. And Yates Brown, who was a kind of friend of the Axis leaders and sort of welcomed by Mussolini and Hitler and other people, he became famous writing a book called Bengal Lancer, or The Lives of the Bengal Lancer in its American version, turned into a film starring Gary Cooper. So, you know, Hitler apparently congratulated him on his brilliant film, although the film bears about as much relation to Yates Brown's life as the book, to Yates Brown's book as the book does to his life, because if you go and read his first book, Caught by the Turks, about being imprisoned in World War I by the Turks and escaping dressed up as a German governess, there's no mention of yoga. But after he'd been to Nyack to study yoga with Pierre Bernard, suddenly in his later books, when he retells the stories, he only survived imprisonment by the Turks by using yogic techniques to save himself. Otherwise but academic researchers like Kate Imey, who've been through all the archives, say that actually he did learn yoga with Bernard and not in India as he claimed. But you know, that's actually evident from reading his books. Yeah.
So you mentioned somebody called Susan Newcomb. So I assume she has done a bit of research, but you have told us why. You know, Susan has, because she talks about only concentrating on one local area rather than this transatlantic approach that you've taken. Yeah. So why is that? Why was that so important?
Well, one of the things, she did a book called Yoga in Britain, which was published about 7 years ago.
7 years ago.
Something like that.
Very recent.
Relatively recent. And she, I mean, she's arguing about secularization of yoga. But having been born in Wimbledon, I have a deep fascination for southwest London and its suburbs. And she writes about a guy called Desmond Dunn, and doesn't actually discover what his real name is, which is James Lee Richardson.
Well, we never discover anyone's real name.
Well, you can do it quite easily. I was doing it even in the 80s. I used to go to the British Library and look up in the old catalogue writers, and quite often you could get their real names and their pen names from looking up in the British Library catalogue. Now you can do it from going online, apart from the cyber hack made that rather difficult, happening at the very moment when I was completing the book. But there's other, you know, you can use the Bodleian Library or whatever as well.
So sort of bringing it to the UK.
Well, she brought it to she says you should study yoga in a specific place to make sense of it. But to me, if you want to look at someone like Yates Brown, to kind of get into his fascism, which is kind of documented in the book, you really need to look at Europe. But to understand his yoga, you need to look at the USA. So for me, you do need a transatlantic model. And I do also look at, you know, Himmler's interest in yoga, which is obviously in Germany, but a lot of that is using other people's work. There's less original research than in some of the later material. And also in Rijeka, where D'Annunzio, the Italian poet, occupied and created a proto-fascist state. There was a yoga group. It's also, you need to look at figures like Crowley, because the yoga emerges through occultism as well. And I mean, also what I was just trying to kind of track back through a lot of material published about yoga, looking for books on yoga and magazine articles on yoga from the kind of pre-war period.
Yeah.
And while some of the names of stuff that was widely circled, like Yogi Ramacharaki, appear to be Indian, that's actually a pen name of
William something.
Walker Aikins.
Yeah.
Aikins. And so, you know, the people spreading yoga in the kind of between North America and Europe in the pre-war period were largely appear to be of European descent.
Well, that's what I wanted to highlight, is that, so beginning in America with Pierre, but then you've been very vigilant about this transatlantic network that then we traveled to 1920, and we're talking about Guido Keller, and we're talking about D'Annunzio. And this, can you tell us about this group, which had, basically they called themselves Yoga, Y-O-G-A in capital letters. And I found them a very fascinating sort of prototype. And I think that's why you've got it in there, to show how these things would emerge and how they're models for what comes later.
I mean, they were kind of connected to the futurists, but had a more backward, pastoral-looking view of the world. And I think, I don't know if people have read Umberto Eco's Fascism essay, where he talks about how fascism has different elements, but it's hard to pin down. So you can have elements A, B, C in one group, and C, D, E in the next group, and then, you know, X, Y, Z in the next group. I'm summarizing crudely because he doesn't go into X, Y, Z, but so you can have groups that you can identify. He basically has about 14 elements of things that would identify a fascist group, and says that you can have groups that have nothing in common, that are fascist, and fascist groups that do have things in common. So what happened in Rijeka, which the Italians called Fiume, after World War I, sovereignty was disputed and the Italians claimed it. And it ended up that D'Annunzio, the poet, or bed-hopping cocaine freak as well, as he's sometimes described, led a kind of ragtag army, proto-fascist army, into Rijeka and occupied it. And so there were various groups, so the futurists were there, and initially the yoga group published a column in their paper. Then towards the end of the kind of D'Annunzio and Guido Keller, who was one of the key figures in the yoga group, was kind of D'Annunzio's lieutenant. A lot of the pageantry of fascism was invented there. So you had the balcony speeches, the Roman salutes, the use of religious iconography in a secular setting, the kind of tributes to the martyrs of the cause, all that kind of stuff. And a very kind of oppressive regime if you happen to be Croatian rather than Italian local. So that was all developed, and they issued 4 issues of the yoga paper before the Treaty of Rapallo kind of put an end to it, and the Italian Navy bombed them, you know, shooting from ships.
And there's been a republication in 2019,
of their,
you've mentioned, of this
for the anniversary of the newspaper, in a book by an Italian academic, which apparently,
with the name Yoga,
and a swastika which they had on their publication, and a life-giving rose as well, I believe. But no, I mean it's quite a well-known story, and there's a lot of cultural wars still going on around that. So you know, the occupation was celebrated in an exhibition in Trieste, which is now in Italy, obviously. And commemorated but not celebrated in what's now Croatia, and there was a diplomatic incident over a statue of denuncio erected in Trieste as well, which the Croatians found very offensive, understandably.
Yeah. Well, I think we can so we go to Italy, we see these sort of groups, and we see this, and then you go to, so I've got everything, it's an extensive chapter list, and there's a lot of characters. I'd like to go to JFC Fuller, our high-ranking member of the British Union of Fascists, who,
So Fuller...
bring it to Britain.
Yeah. Yates Brown did as well. But Fuller was a disciple of Crowley, but also an unreconstructed fascist. And Aleister Crowley, who people probably know, I referenced him earlier. In the earlier part of the 20th century, the press called him the wickedest man in the world because he did sex magic. And he was a member of the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, which shouldn't be confused with the Greek political party of more recent times. Although the name may not be a coincidence, they may have taken it from there. But Crowley wasn't a political fascist, although some people argue there are fascistic elements to him. But he had Fuller as a disciple, and he was in many ways one of the first accessible yoga teachers in England. He had a mentor in the Golden Dawn, Alan Bennett, who...
Is this the 1930s, just for...
No,
still 20s?
Even before the 20s for Fuller's book was published in the 20s.
Okay, yeah.
And a lot of these books were published by a publisher called Ryder, who people may know, a famous occult imprint. So Crowley taught Fuller yoga. Again, he claimed to have learnt it in the army in India, the same as Yates Brown. Again, Kate Imey, the academic, has been through the archives of his material and says this isn't actually true.
I'm just quoting you here. He says he focused on time in India. He was cured of his feverish illness, disobedient bowels.
This is Yates Brown.
This is Yates Brown.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
But Fuller... he broke with Crowley because he felt Crowley didn't defend himself vigorously enough about being called gay, or as we'd say now, or homosexual when he did sex magic with men. Crowley was famously bisexual. But he continued using Crowley's kind of yoga and magical system. But coming from an occult side of things, Crowley was not interested in the specificity of local religious rites. He was like Blavatsky before him, looking for a universal occult truth. So he famously says in his lectures on yoga, the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, only 90 to 95% of it can be dismissed as the ravings of a disordered mind. The remaining 5% or whatever is pure gold, which I now bestow. But he's not looking, he has a very clearly anti-Orientalist stance in relation to this, which is quite interesting.
But then Fuller stopped mentioning, he wanted to no longer, later he stops sort of citing Crowley.
Yeah, he doesn't, he only mentions him as some shamefaced sex.
Yeah.
And claims that he learned his yoga from Indians, which archival research suggests he didn't. But he produced this famous book on yoga, which is still being, Yates Brown as well, who was a paid-up fascist. When you come to the post-war, these books, because there was probably less material on yoga at the time, well, there was less material, still being quoted in the post-war period by people like Harvey Day, who I have a chapter on, who was a kind of successful hack non-fiction writer of the time, of the 50s through to the 80s, who's now largely forgotten. But he's explicitly anti-racist and anti-Nazi and proud of fighting against the Axis in World War II, but at the same time is quite happy to, as are other ostensibly non-fascist yoga writers in the post-war period, to quote Fuller and to quote Yates Brown. I was going to wind it back a bit as well to talk about some of those influences going into the 30s.
And also, like Jacob Wilhelm and Well,
there's, the Nazi.
We need to get into a bit of the Nazi stuff.
Well, I wanted to wind it back to my place of birth and childhood haunts.
Yes, you should.
New Malden was somewhere I have very many happy childhood memories of. It's near to Surbiton for people who don't know southwest London. I never actually lived there, but I had a relative who did, which is close to where I did live. You know, I just knew New Malden as this essentially quite boring southwest London bleeding into the suburbs place. And then when I read the Susan Newcomb book and she was talking about Desmond Dunn, I thought, and I had his books anyway, because it's weird because now if you want to buy any book online, they all seem to be extortionately expensive, and I don't buy much secondhand online. But when I was doing the research, all the books I wanted would be a penny plus the postage, and a lot of them you couldn't get in the British Library because they were only American editions, but including one of Desmond Dunn's was published by Parker, which is an interesting imprint. But anyway, when I went back and found his name on the British Library catalogue, or the Bodleian, or whichever one I found it on, and then started chasing him up, he became this really curious figure, because there were claims that online that he was a guy called James Cumberbatch, but he was involved in a lot of psychical research, did these mail order courses on yoga mail order courses, which he sold from New Malden, which I immediately got my interest in, also because I was able to identify who he was through clues in his books and his marriage and stuff. So his first book about, it's a kind of encyclopedia resource book about spiritualism. He thanks his fiancée in the introduction, who helped with the kind of editorial work, called M. Kemp, and someone with his name, James Lee Richardson, married a Minnie Kemp in the following year from this book being published. So I can, you know, by tracing through, prove that this is the correct identification and not the wrong one that people have made online and is reproduced in some library catalogue. So you can't always believe it. But, you know, now, I mean, I used to go and do this kind of ancestral research in the archives back in the day, but now you can just go on Ancestry, and when they've got a free offer for 2 weeks free use, you can kind of tear through their research materials, because all those things are digitized and you can find the material quite easily. But yeah, it's a matter of tying things together. But what fascinated me about Lee Richardson was, one, he came from New Malden, which is not necessarily the most exciting place in the world, but it did lead me to revisit it earlier this year for the first time in about 40 years. The last time I'd been had been to look at a bedsit, which I decided not to take, and I think I ended up moving to Stoke Newington or something. So he had a whole series of pseudonyms, and as James Lee, but spelled with a GH on the end rather than LEE, as his James Lee Richardson name is. He edited a magazine called Prediction, which was mainly run out Store Street in W1. And, you know, that has material on yoga going back. You know, there's articles on yoga. There's an interesting yoga. You see it on the cover from, I'm trying to remember when in the 30s the first one was published, but it was going through the 30s. He edited it from the 30s through to 53 or something, 52, 53, when he gave it up. And he was also running occult mail order courses. So if you look at his yoga mail order course, the lower level one, at the end of it, he recommends that you study ancient practices like tarot. We know that tarot actually isn't thousands of years old now, as he claims, as there's been a lot of research into it. And it wasn't originally a divinatory system. But Lee Richardson is promoting yoga and promoting a lot of occult practices through Prediction, through these magazines, and through his yoga course. Sorry, I probably lost the point of where I was going with all this.
No, you wanted to return home.
I wanted to return
to New Malden.
Yeah, of course.
And we were talking about the mail order, which is actually quite important. So that was pre-war.
No, the mail order...
Wasn't that post-war?
It's post-war, yeah, but he was editing Prediction magazine and carrying a lot of articles on yoga in the 30s.
But I think the mail order thing is quite important. So, I mean, because even the Golden Dawn, they've had a mail order. I mean, there's been, all of these outfits have had, mail order has been a big deal for...
Well, it's how the
Yeah.
kind of the dissemination method of the period worked. So mail order was how you could learn yoga in the mid-20th century. And Lee Richardson wasn't just selling it in the UK, he had offices set up in the US and around the world.
Yeah.
So that he was, teaching people around the world. I mean, he wasn't selling it in India as far as I can tell, but he was selling it in Australia and in the US.
And this is being transmitted. So this version of whatever this is, right, is being transmitted, and that's a very important point of the book as well. So what are you saying? Don't call it yoga.
Well, I'm not.
Because it ain't yoga. Because I actually agree with that. I do agree with that.
Well, I think the thing is you can call it yoga, but you have to understand that in that case it's a homonym, as yoga is also for you, because it has more than one meaning. But it isn't this ancient Indian religious practice that people are doing. It's a mix of things, and there's different strands. So you have the occult strand feeding in one way, and you have the European gymnastics strand feeding in another. Yeah.
And it's like what you were saying about you go to a class and it becomes quite arbitrary. It's like everyone is empowered, and we should talk about this. So the idea that all these fascists sort of came upon, first of all, the Aryan, like, oh yes, it's our heritage. But then the other thing, this guru relationship, which I think will take us then into what we were talking about Hitler and stuff.
Yeah.
This idea that you have this hierarchy of guru and relationship between the two, so you can create this sort of body of willing, whatever you want to call them.
You can see the parallel for the fascist yogis between guru and chela, or student, and Führer and masses. It's the same relationship,
and
essentially.
you mentioned that there's a character, and we will have to hop timelines because we've got this amount of time. But you mentioned, so there's this other character in the book, Indra Devi, and that's post-war, I believe.
It kind of straddles. But again, she was initially interested in yoga through.
Who says that Hitler?
Oh no, sorry. In Savitri Devi.
Savitri Devi.
There are two. Most of the people covered are male because it tends to be patriarchal fascism.
It is.
But there are two female yogis covered, neither of whom were originally called Devi, but both adopted the name Devi for reasons we can guess. Goddess being attractive to them. So we're talking about Savitri Devi, right? So Savitri Devi was an esoteric Hitlerist.
Listen to this.
And this is where we can bring in some of the kind of parallels between contemporary kind of far-right conspiracy theory. She's the key figure, and then the later key figure in esoteric Hitlerism is Miguel Serrano, who's Chilean. But the belief is for Devi is that Hitler is the 10th incarnation of Vishnu as Kalki. So Hitler is this supernatural being who returns whenever he's needed. Akhenaten, Genghis Khan, and Hitler are all the same person.
Okay, we need this, Stewart. We need to know this.
And she'd been interested in. She had mixed roots, European roots, and so she, partly Greek, partly English, French, all sorts of things.
Actual sort of birth name?
Don't.
No, we
did mention it.
We did mention it. It was something like Mariano.
No.
Miriam.
You can read it in the book.
Yeah, it's in the book. But just
I have too many things to remember.
I know.
Remember the original names of esoteric Hitlerists gets. It's not the top of my list of priorities. But anyway, so, and she has a whole critique of lightning and the sun, and in which incarnation he did too much solar warming, and which incarnation too much lightning of violence. But Hitler is the perfection of it. So after the war, she tried to she played an intermediary role between Indian nationalists who were fighting the British and Japanese during the war. And after the war, she wanted to refound National Socialism as a religion, with Hitler as this icon. And then Serrano, the Chilean, kind of got in the game a little bit later, and was also pushing this line, but coming out of it connects in with stories that were in the Latin American press about Nazi UFOs and stuff. So all this stuff gets dragged in, this madness. Yeah. But if you think of Hitler as being portrayed as a supernatural being who's going to save the world, and then you think about QAnon and Trump being portrayed as a supernatural being who's going to portray the world, you can see. Again, this is the thing. It's like it might be possible to trace a direct line of transmission, but it's also the forms mythology take could just lead to people coming up with the same idea without there actually being a direct transmission of the concept between them. But I can't answer whether that happened or not. And within the Nazi regime, Hitler does not appear to have been interested in yoga. But Himmler was influenced by Hauer, who was a kind of professor of religion. Himmler and the SS were genuinely interested in this material, and Himmler supposedly carried around Hindu religious texts.
Yeah, and his wife, you talk about Hitler's wife, we get a bit of insight.
Eva Braun.
Eva Braun was quite a yogi.
Well, that's arguable.
I mean,
Eva Braun has been pictured, and people claim it as yoga
the
doing
perception.
backbends. But whether she was doing yoga or whether she was doing the gymnastics that fed into modern postural practice.
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I'm saying
because
yogi.
I have this problem because I still do the odd thing, like, someone sees me in the gym doing a planche. They say, "Oh, you're still doing yoga, Stewart." It's like, no, I'm not doing peacock. It's a planche.
I'm with you.
And the same when I do my headstand.
Namings are important.
I only do basket headstands in private because people will claim I'm doing yoga. I always do the tripod in public now.
Well, I wanted to say, because I know that the sort of COVID time sort of brought a lot of this stuff to light for you in a whole more pressing way. So maybe we could just talk about that and why that is like important. You mentioned that the most visible modern postural practice QAnon cheerleader, you mentioned Crystal Tini.
As one of them, yeah.
Yeah, as one of them who came to light in lockdown.
Because they were pushing a lot of conspiracy theories and QAnon stuff around. I mean, it wasn't only Tini. Obviously, possibly the most famous one now is the QAnon shaman, who I don't mention in the book.
We've all seen him.
But we've all seen him. He ought to be in jail, but he isn't.
But yeah, that sort of brought a lot of things to light that you wanted to...
And I also, but we promised not to get too into this because we had slightly differing views on...
Well, we didn't want to, but it was important that you said that it sort of blew the lid off for you a little bit more.
Yeah, because obviously to have a very individualized response to a pandemic which affects everyone, and so think that I can do my own thing and that doesn't affect other people. I mean, I'm also completely horrified by the outbreaks of measles that are going on right now.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And certainly, I mentioned this in the book before the pandemic because I stopped going to yoga before the pandemic.
Same.
To any classes. What I would hear is about MMR, and those studies are completely discredited. They've been removed. It's been shown that the authors of the studies that linked MMR to autism had a financial interest in doing so. And also there's a whole issue of ableism around kind of portraying having a dead child is better than having an autistic one, essentially, when you're doing that anti-MMR campaign too.
Yeah, that's pretty Nazi right there. Okay, so how are we doing for time? Where are we at? How much time do we have?
We need to leave time for questions.
Yeah, so... Okay, so we can sort of segue into post-war, I think.
So yeah, I've mixed it up a bit already. But
no, we have mixed it up. It's like it's my I tried to make the notes pre-war, post-war. We're at Savitri Devi, Indra Devi, and you've even done the mail order. There's the quote here that I have is, during the 20th century, mail order courses played a key role in the global reception of many exercise and occult systems, even with the bodybuilding system of Charles Atlas, which you're interested in bodybuilding, as you've told me.
Weight training and
yeah, as well.
Yeah,
this is part of your repertoire.
That's I mean, the thing about bodybuilding is bodybuilders are good at building big muscles, and weightlifters are good at building strength. So there's a kind of difference. As you can see, I'm not a bodybuilder.
But I mean, to do a headstand, you have to have quite a strong core.
Yeah.
So you've sort of built that up over the years.
Yeah, and there's all sorts of exercises that help with that. But
well, okay, I said this to you when we were talking. From my understanding of yoga, it very much is the anti-hierarchical approach, where you choose, let's say, one posture, it just for whatever reason, and you just pursue it. You can just do the one posture, and it's about the time of the day, the time of the year, your body, how you're feeling. It's not about someone. So in some of the Ashtanga classes, as I told you, you will see teachers sitting on people and forcing them into postures, which is completely not. If a teacher does that to you, run from the class. So what I was saying to Stewart, I was like, Stewart, well, that is what you've done for the last 20 years. You just chose a posture. So I would argue that you are actually quite much rather more, from my understanding, a proper yogi.
I just didn't fit in with the modern postural classes,
eschewing all of this sort of guru shit. From my understanding of it, is like the guru is within you, sort of thing. Like, find your way. Don't be like following all these fascist teachers. And that's where my path ended as well. And then you end your book in the sort of, is it just at the end of 50s, 60s, 70s?
70s, yeah.
Yeah. So why did you decide to end there?
There's a whole lot of reasons.
Yeah, but we discussed a little bit.
I mean, one is that you can clearly see up to that point the people influencing the discourse are primarily European or of European descent.
Yeah.
And then it gets more complicated. The 60s, you have the more Indian gurus starting coming in, and Indian yoga teachers coming to London. So I wanted to kind of focus on... We said we should mention, actually, that this book is, according to Amazon, #1 bestseller in their History of Hindu Studies.
This is
whereas I deliberately wanted to avoid the whole issue in Hindu Vista, although I do have an Indian publisher and I had to write an introduction for the Indian edition relating it. Yeah, that's done. Relating it a little bit to Modi and the BJP.
Yeah.
Before I did the book, I did some blogging on it, and I did go into some of that stuff then, the Hindu Vista stuff. But with the book, I really didn't, because I wanted to focus on something and be very clear that we're not talking about an Indian tradition in the book. So that was one thing. Two, there was a fragmentation of how, and a transformation of how exercise systems were transmitted. So in the 80s, you had a lot, aerobics was a big thing. And a lot of the...
My mum was an aerobics instructor.
As well as...
Later.
And a lot of that was transmitted on VHS.
Yes, so Jane Fonda.
Yeah, Jane Fonda, exactly. I mean, one of the things I don't particularly go into the book is... but if you go back to people like Jan Todd, who's a champion weightlifter, American, but she's also an academic to do with history of sports. So she writes a lot about the split between male and female exercise in the 19th century, and the kind of what you can see as yoga, and also Pilates, which has a different history, obviously, but it's often associated with yoga. They come out of this idea of kind of women should be weak and decorous, so you don't build muscle and strength, which she's very much against, and counterposes with what she calls majestic womanhood, Jan Todd. So yoga is coming out of that tradition, but reason for stopping in the late 70s was things became more fragmented. Things became much more hybrid, although it's clearly a hybrid, a mishmash of things.
Well, the reason I was just, I think, I know we don't, I think it is important though to mention, Modi with his yoga day. To me, it made, after reading your book also, that made a lot of sense, because if he's identifying with his sort of supreme race caste system, and this lot are talking about their supreme race, then it makes sense that he too would use up yoga.
Yeah, and what's...
in its Western iteration.
Yeah, exactly, because the physical practice was never as emphasized on the Indian continent. And yet with International Yoga Day, which interestingly, when it happened this year, I asked a few people I know who do yoga, including one who'd been to a class just hours before what day it was, and the reaction was, "Oh, do you think I'm stupid? It's the solstice." No, but apart from being the solstice, what day is it?
I don't think it took off.
No, it hasn't taken off here.
Outside
but whereas
of India.
if you look at the Indian press, there's all this stuff celebrating it as a global thing.
Yeah.
And this minister did 60 press-ups. Well, what's doing 60 anyone could be doing 60 press-ups. It's, if you're going to be a press-up champion or a planking champion, you're going to have to go a bit harder than that.
Well, I think what you just said is important from my perspective. So if we were to say that there was a text, just to share this, that is, the yogic text, it would be like the sutras of Patanjali, that I really found it interesting how you described, I think it was Crowley, how he describes it. What it is that there are only 3 sutras that, what you just said, about the physical practice. The rest are all like about mind and vibing and universe. So actually, and that was when the penny dropped for me in also the 2000s, and I was like, wait a minute, like, why are we so obsessed with this postural practice? Because that's the sutras. So yeah, it comes back to this.
Actually, I realized another reason why I finished where I did was I finished with a guy called Frank Rudolph Young, who did in the early 50s was pumping out mail order courses, including kind of pickup type courses. He's a precursor to the pickup artist, how to control the opposite sex, all this stuff. But he also did initially books in the 60s called things like Yoga for Men. But then he obviously realized he was losing more than half his audience. So in his later yoga books, yoga not only builds huge muscles in men, because he'd also sold muscle building courses, it slenderizes women for the same exercise. But what I think is most fantastic about him is in his books, he did a whole series of occult books and occult exercises. But he basically writes in his books about how I expect to live to be 330 years old or older. He actually died at 91, which isn't bad, having gone senile first. But because his claims are so outrageous and nuts, I kind of thought it was a good place to stop as well.
Yeah. So should we do Q&A now?
Yes.